The Leaning Tower of Pisa was not born as a mistake. It was born as a dream of greatness. To understand why this project was too big to succeed, we need to go back in time, long before the tower began to lean. We must return to 12th century Italy, a period marked by territorial disputes, wars between rival cities, and an almost obsessive pursuit of prestige and power. At that time, Pisa was not an ordinary city. It was one of the wealthiest maritime republics in Europe, directly competing with Genoa, Venice, and Florence. Every military victory and every conquered trade route needed to be displayed in a visible, monumental, almost provocative way. And it was in this context that the idea emerged to build a massive religious complex, now known as the Piazza dei Miracoli, the Square of Miracles. The plan included an imposing cathedral, a colossal baptistery, and of course, a tower that would serve as a bell tower. But this tower could not be ordinary. It had to be tall, elegant, made of white marble, and above all, impressive. A symbol that would shout to the world, Pisa is powerful. The problem is that when projects are born more from vanity than logic, risk becomes inevitable. The architects of the time did not yet fully understand soil behavior, nor possess advanced structural calculations. Even so, they decided to erect a tower dozens of meters high on land that, although beautiful and flat, hid an invisible danger: unstable soil composed of clay, sand, and underground water. On paper, everything seemed possible. In reality, the tower was already doomed from the very first stone. If you're enjoying this story and like learning about ambitious projects that went wrong, now is the perfect time to subscribe to the Wrong Project channel, leave a like, and comment below. Do you think the Leaning Tower of Pisa should have been built despite all the risks? Construction began in 1173 with absolute confidence. The first floors rose quickly, and nothing seemed out of place. The marble shone under the sun, the foundations appeared solid, and the city celebrated. But there was a cruel detail. The mistake was still waiting to reveal itself. The Leaning Tower of Pisa did not begin to fail due to immediate negligence. It began to fail because it was too ambitious for the knowledge of its time. And when engineering meets arrogance, collapse is no longer a distant possibility. It becomes only a matter of time, and time, as we will see, does not forgive poorly calculated projects. If the dream of greatness was the starting point of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the soil was its true executioner. Unlike visible mistakes such as poor calculations or weak materials, the problem that doomed the tower was hidden underground, far from the eyes of the builders and the population that celebrated each new floor. The region of Pisa is located near the Arno River, on a plain formed by sediments accumulated over thousands of years. This means the ground is composed of alternating layers of clay, fine sand, and underground water. For light constructions, this type of soil might work. For a massive marble tower dozens of meters tall, it was practically a trap. In the 12th century, knowledge of soil mechanics did not exist. There were no deep surveys, geotechnical studies, or structural simulations. Builders evaluated the land superficially, checking whether it felt firm and whether it supported smaller nearby structures. This turned out to be a fatal mistake. The foundation of the Leaning Tower of Pisa was about 3 meters deep. Today, this sounds absurd, but at the time, it seemed sufficient. The problem is that such a shallow foundation distributed the weight unevenly, especially as the structure gained height and mass. Around the 3rd floor, something began to happen. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic cracks. Instead, something far more silent and far more dangerous occurred. One side of the tower began to sink a few centimeters more than the other. This small imbalance was enough to completely alter the structure's equilibrium. The weight started concentrating on one side, increasing the sinking even further. An invisible domino effect had begun. The most frightening part is that at that moment, no one fully understood what was happening. Builders knew something was wrong, but they lacked the technical tools to explain it. To them, it seemed like divine punishment, a bad omen, or simple bad luck. In reality, the tower was behaving exactly as physics dictates. The soil slowly yielded, compressed under excessive weight. Every new stone added made the situation worse. The tower was not falling, and it was being swallowed by the ground beneath it. This is one of the most tragic and fascinating aspects of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It did not fail because of isolated incompetence, but because of a collective lack of knowledge of the time. It was a project too advanced for a world that did not yet understand the forces acting beneath its feet, and the worst was yet to come, because when the error finally became visible, it was already too late to turn back. For years, the Leaning Tower of Pisa seemed to defy serious suspicion. Even as the soil slowly gave way, the process was so gradual that many believed it was merely an optical illusion or a minor imperfection. But there came a moment when the error stopped being invisible and forced itself into plain sight. When construction reached approximately the third and fourth floors, workers began to notice something impossible to ignore. The columns were no longer perfectly aligned. The floors did not seem completely level. The vertical axis of the tower started drifting away from the center. The tilt, still small, was already real. This was the moment when the project stopped being merely risky and became frightening. For medieval engineers, there was no handbook for this situation. Never before had a tower of such scale been built on such unstable ground. Technical knowledge was based on practical experience, tradition, and trial and error. And at that moment, they were witnessing an error unfold in real time. News spread quickly throughout the city. A construction meant to display power was becoming a source of concern. The fear was not only structural, but symbolic. If the tower collapsed, it wouldn't just be stone on the ground. It would be Pisa's reputation in ruins. The builders tried to understand the problem by observing the structure itself. They realized that one side of the foundation had sunk more than the other, creating a lever-like effect. The tower was not leaning because of poor workmanship, but because the base no longer provided uniform support. Faced with this, a difficult decision emerged: continue or stop the construction. Stopping meant admitting failure. It meant accepting that the city's most ambitious project might never be completed. Continuing meant challenging gravity, the ground, and the unknown. The solution was to halt construction, and this pause, which would last for decades, completely changed the tower's fate. What seemed like a temporary defeat became, without anyone realizing it, its greatest chance of survival. During this period of inactivity, the soil continued to slowly settle under the existing weight. Pressure decreased, the ground compacted, and the sinking slowed. Unintentionally, the builders gave the tower something precious: time. While wars ravaged the region and resources were diverted to military conflicts, the Leaning Tower of Pisa stood there, unfinished, tilted, and silent. A constant reminder that even the grandest projects can be interrupted by invisible forces. This forced interval did not solve the problem, but it prevented it from becoming fatal at that moment. When construction resumed, the error would still be there. But the tower had survived its first great test, and the next step would be even riskier. When construction of the Leaning Tower of Pisa resumed decades after the first interruption, the situation was completely different. The city had changed, the people in charge of the project had changed, and the world around it was no longer the same. But the tower remained there, unfinished, leaning and carrying an unresolved problem. The new builders knew one thing for certain: the tower was crooked. What they did not know was how to fix it safely. Structural science as we know it today did not exist, and decisions were still based on observation, intuition, and bold experimentation. Faced with the visible tilt, an idea emerged that initially seemed brilliant: compensate for the original error. If the tower was leaning to one side, then the next floors could be built slightly tilted in the opposite direction. In theory, this would redistribute the weight and bring the final axis of the tower closer to the center. It was a creative solution, and an extremely dangerous one. From that moment on, each new floor carried not only the weight of stone, but also the weight of a risky decision. Floors began to have different heights on opposite sides, columns varied in size, and the original symmetry of the project was slowly sacrificed. The tower began to take on a subtly curved shape, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but obvious to anyone analyzing its structure. It was no longer just a leaning tower. It was a tower trying to correct itself. The major problem was that this correction did not eliminate the root cause of the error. The soil remained the same. The foundation was still shallow. The base continued to suffer from uneven sinking. What the builders were doing was merely redistributing the risk, not eliminating it. Even so, construction continued. Each new floor was a symbolic victory against gravity and, at the same time, a new challenge to the laws of physics. The tower grew taller, the tilt increased, and the margin for error shrank. This period marked one of the most tense moments in the history of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The project could no longer return to its starting point. Dismantling the structure was unthinkable. Abandoning it would mean admitting irreversible failure. The only option left was to move forward, hoping the fragile balance would hold. And almost ironically, it did. Not because the problem had been solved, but because the tower found a temporary point of stability. A fragile, unstable, and dangerous equilibrium, sustained by bold decisions and a great deal of luck. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was now officially condemned to live tilted. And from that moment on, every passing century would become a silent test between human engineering and the forces of nature. After the bold decisions that marked the resumption of construction, the Leaning Tower of Pisa entered a curious phase of its existence. It began to simply endure. There were no major structural corrections or definitive solutions. What followed were centuries of silent observation, constant fear, and forced adaptation to the reality that the project would never be perfect. Construction was officially completed in the 14th century, when the final level and the bell chamber were finished. The tower was far from vertical, but it was still standing. For many, that alone was considered a miracle built on a mistake. During this period, the tilt did not stop. It continued to increase slowly, almost imperceptibly, from one generation to the next. The soil kept settling, and the tower responded to this movement like a living body, adapting to its own instability. Architects, scholars, and local authorities knew something was wrong, but no one knew exactly what to do. Demolishing the tower was unthinkable. Rebuilding it from scratch was impossible, and attempting to fix it without sufficient technical knowledge could trigger collapse. So the chosen strategy was the most human of all: living with the problem. The tower began to influence the surrounding architecture. Nearby buildings were designed to respect its condition, avoiding interventions that might disturb the soil. The monument became a delicate presence, almost untouchable, as if any change could awaken something dangerous. Throughout this long historical period, the Leaning Tower of Pisa survived earthquakes, wars, invasions, and deep political changes. Each extreme event tested the structure's fragile balance, and yet it remained there, tilted, defying expectations. The fear of collapse was always present. Historical records show that at certain times, areas around the tower were restricted as a precaution. The tilt was measured in rudimentary ways, comparing shadows, visual angles, and fixed references. Over time, something curious happened. What began as a shameful defect gradually became a unique characteristic. The Leaning Tower started to attract attention, visitors and curiosity. The mistake became an identity. But this shift in perception did not eliminate the danger. The Leaning Tower of Pisa was surviving on a temporary balance, a mistake supported by history itself, waiting for the moment when science would finally be able to intervene. And when that moment arrived, the challenge would be greater than ever. With the arrival of the modern era, the Leaning Tower of Pisa stopped being merely a historical monument and became a real scientific problem. The tilt, which had increased slowly for centuries, began to seriously concern engineers, mathematicians, and physicists. Now there were numbers, precise measurements, and projections indicating something alarming. The tower was approaching a dangerous point of no return. In the 19th century, the first documented attempts at intervention appeared. The intentions were good, but the knowledge was still limited. Some ideas seemed logical at the time, but today sound almost desperate. Among them were attempts to reinforce the base with new materials and even proposals for partial excavation to correct the tower's axis. The problem was that any poorly calculated action could worsen the instability. The tower had already found a fragile balance. Changing that balance without fully understanding the forces involved was like disturbing a pile of stones about to collapse. As the 20th century progressed, measurements became more alarming. The tilt exceeded 5 degrees, and mathematical models suggested that if nothing were done, the tower could collapse within a few decades. For the first time in its history, the risk of failure stopped being theoretical and became statistically likely. The most critical moment came at the end of the 20th century. The situation was so severe that in 1990, Italian authorities made a drastic decision: close the Leaning Tower of Pisa to the public. Access was forbidden, the surrounding area was isolated, and the world watched in silence as an icon stood on the verge of collapse. The tower was losing the war against gravity. This period marked a symbolic turning point. The era that had been tolerated, admired, and even celebrated now had to be confronted with absolute seriousness. It was no longer about preserving a historical curiosity, but about preventing an irreversible disaster. Engineers from around the world were called in. Experts in soil mechanics, structural engineering, dynamics, and physics worked together to understand exactly how to save a tower that should never have been built this way. Every proposal was analyzed with extreme caution. Completely straightening the tower was ruled out. That could destroy its identity and, worse, compromise its stability. The goal became clear: not to correct the mistake, but to prevent it from becoming fatal. The Leaning Tower of Pisa had survived for centuries thanks to luck, historical pauses, and improvised adaptations. Now it depended entirely on modern science to continue existing. And the plan that was about to be executed would be one of the most delicate and risky in the history of engineering. Saving the Leaning Tower of Pisa was not just an engineering challenge. It was a matter of cultural identity, historical responsibility, and scientific limits. When the stabilization project officially began in the early 1990s, engineers knew that any mistake could lead to the definitive collapse of one of the most famous monuments on Earth. The first major challenge was to deeply understand the tower's behavior. Sensors were installed throughout the structure to measure, in real time, minute movements, vibrations, and soil changes. Nothing could be done without precise data. Every millimeter mattered. One of the most controversial ideas, which eventually became the main solution, was the controlled removal of soil beneath the higher side of the tower. At first glance, this seemed completely absurd, removing earth from an already unstable foundation. But in practice, the goal was to allow the less sunken side to slowly settle, reducing the overall tilt. It was a high-risk surgical operation. Before any excavation began, the tower was temporarily stabilized using steel cables and massive lead counterweights placed on the opposite side of the lean. These weights did not fix the problem, but prevented it from worsening during the intervention. The process was slow and painstaking. Small amounts of soil were removed over months. After each step, measurements were taken, analyses reviewed, and decisions reassessed. Any unexpected movement could have meant the end of the project. Remarkably, the tower responded exactly as engineers had predicted. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, it began to straighten slightly. Not enough to lose its identity, but enough to move away from the zone of extreme danger. Over nearly a decade of work, the tilt was reduced by approximately 40 centimeters at the top. That may sound minor, but structurally it made a massive difference. Pressure on the soil decreased, and the tower's overall balance improved significantly. In 2001, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was reopened to the public. For the first time in centuries, experts confidently stated that it was stable, at least for the next 200 years. The project was considered one of the greatest successes of modern engineering, not because it eliminated the mistake, but because it managed to control a historical error without destroying it. The Leaning Tower of Pisa had been saved, and more than that, it had become an eternal symbol of humanity's ability to learn from its own failures. After surviving centuries of instability and one of the most delicate engineering operations ever performed, the Leaning Tower of Pisa entered a new phase of its existence, that of a global symbol. What was once seen as an embarrassing failure became precisely the reason for its fame. The mistake was not erased, it was immortalized. The tower's tilt completely transformed public perception. Unlike monuments built to showcase perfection, symmetry, and absolute control, the Leaning Tower of Pisa stood out precisely because it seemed to defy those rules. It represented not only power or faith, but also fragility, improvisation, and persistence. With the growth of international tourism, especially from the 20th century onward, the tower became one of the most photographed landmarks on Earth. People from all over the world began visiting it, not despite the error, but because of it. The classic pose of holding the tower spread globally, reinforcing the idea that the tilt was no longer a flaw. It was a signature. Culturally, the Leaning Tower of Pisa came to symbolize something far greater than its own history. It became a visual reminder that human projects rarely turn out exactly as planned, and yet they can survive, adapt, and even become legendary. Interestingly, this iconic status was only possible because the mistake was never fully corrected. Had the tower been completely straightened, it would have lost what made it unique. Preserving the tilt was also a narrative decision, keeping the story of controlled failure alive. The tower began appearing in films, books, animations, logos, and countless cultural references. It became a recurring metaphor for unstable situations that somehow continue to function. An unintentional symbol of human creativity in the face of chaos. But this fame did not come without responsibility. With every visitor, every vibration, and every climatic change, the tower continues to be monitored. The error is celebrated, but never forgotten. Science remains vigilant, ensuring the icon does not once again flirt with collapse. The Leaning Tower of Pisa proves that not every project needs to be perfect to be eternal. Sometimes, it is precisely the flaws that transform something ordinary into something unforgettable. The story of the Leaning Tower of Pisa goes far beyond a tilted tower. At its core, it is a living manual on the limits of human ambition. Every phase of its existence, from conception to near collapse, from embarrassment to global symbol, carries profound lessons that remain relevant centuries later. The first major lesson is simple, but often ignored. No project can defy physical reality without consequences. The Leaning Tower of Pisa did not collapse immediately because nature is patient, but it never forgave the initial mistake. The unstable soil, ignored at the beginning, demanded its price over time. No matter how beautiful or symbolic a project may be, physics always has the final say. The second lesson concerns the danger of excessive confidence. Pisa believed that wealth, power, and tradition were enough to overcome any technical obstacle. This mindset led to underestimated risks and decisions made without scientific grounding. The tower stands as a permanent reminder that authority does not replace knowledge. Another fundamental lesson is the importance of adaptation. Over the centuries, the tower survived not because it was correct, but because it was continuously observed, respected, and, when possible, adjusted. The construction pause, improvised decisions, and later modern scientific intervention show that flexibility can be as important as planning. There is also a lesson about narrative and identity. The Leaning Tower of Pisa's era was not erased because, at some point, it stopped being seen as a failure and began to be understood as part of its story. By accepting imperfection, humanity transformed a problem into cultural heritage. The tower teaches us that fixing everything is not always the best solution. Sometimes preserving the mistake, as long as it is controlled, is more valuable than eliminating it. This logic applies not only to monuments, but to ideas, projects, and even personal decisions. Finally, the Leaning Tower of Pisa serves as a silent warning for any grand project. The greater the ambition, the greater the respect required for invisible details. What cannot be seen, the soil, the calculations, the limits, is precisely what supports everything that can be seen. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. A monument famous for being wrong remains standing precisely because at some point, someone chose to stop, observe, and learn from the mistake. At the end of its long and unstable journey, the Leaning Tower of Pisa remains standing as one of the most powerful examples of how a mistake can endure for centuries and become a legacy. What began as a project too ambitious for the knowledge of its time ended as one of the most recognizable structures in human history. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is not admired for its perfection. It is admired for its resilience in the face of failure. Every degree of tilt, every centimeter of deviation carries the memory of miscalculated decisions, desperate attempts at correction, and above all, humanity's ability to persist despite error. Few projects in the world have been tested by time as intensely as this one. The tower survived wars, earthquakes, neglect, risky interventions, and the constant threat of collapse. In many moments, it survived not because someone had all the answers, but because someone had the courage to stop, wait, and avoid making things worse. This may be the most profound lesson of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Action is not always the best solution. Sometimes, recognizing one's limits is the smartest move. The construction pause, centuries of observation, and the decision not to fully straighten the tower show that humility can save what arrogance placed at risk. Today, millions of people visit the Leaning Tower of Pisa every year. They laugh, take photos, strike creative poses, and often do not realize they are standing before a monument that almost never existed. A monument that remains only because humanity slowly learned to respect physics, time, and its own mistakes. Within the context of Wrong Project, the Leaning Tower of Pisa holds a special place. It is not merely a project that went wrong, it is a project that went wrong for centuries and still prevailed. It prevailed not by fixing the mistake, but by accepting it, controlling it, and transforming it into identity. Perhaps that is why the Leaning Tower of Pisa continues to fascinate the world, because deep down it reflects something deeply human, the idea that failure is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is exactly the beginning. And so, tilted, imperfect, and eternally defying gravity, the Leaning Tower of Pisa remains, not as a warning of shame, but as a monument to the survival of human error.